And of course, we have the former Prime Minister of Georgia to act as consultant to us, right? Mr. Basti Edem, you are the National President of NASIMA, which is the umbrella arm for the private sector. What's your take on all this that you've heard so far?
Listening to His Excellency the Vice President and to Mr. Gulari, I see very clear that we still have a lot to catch up, plenty of gaps. I think Obi has really come out clearly to speak on how to cover those gaps. But I want to look at it from the business side, that we must have a continuous reform for business to actually thrive. Otherwise, the business tend to follow what the government is doing. So looking at the world regulation for businesses to operate, we have 9 areas we look at. You look at how to start a business, the ease of starting a business. You look at the dealing with permits. We look at registering a new business, getting credits, protecting investors, paying taxes, trading across border, enforcing contracts, and closing a business. Of these 9, apart from taxes, the remaining 8 refer to businesses. Now the point 9 is that there must be some form of environment that enables these businesses to operate. A situation where we have to think about power not being sufficient, and think about how to get power to power our factories. The situation where we can't even move goods from point A to point B because of the state of the roads. A situation where even to get the credits to be able to meet up with our production, you need to go and borrow at 26-28% because the MPR is put at 13%. These are factors that are affecting businesses and not allowing businesses to move. So, policy inconsistency is another issue where the government brings up one policy, we try to operate to meet that policy. Just before you are halfway, the policy changes. And you start wondering, how do you now operate? How do you now get through to meet what is happening? So we look at the situation. The Vice President said earlier on that, look, we're looking at issues of zero budgeting. And I start wondering, to set up the budget policy, have we taken into consideration the private sector input? I don't know whether the private sector is actually involved in the budgetary process. Because at the end of it, what happens, we now get the budget policy, we now get the budget out, and the business sector is left out, or perhaps try to meet up with the budget policy, and maybe halfway, there's budget inconsistencies, and it's not able for business to actually operate. So in a nutshell, continuous reform is the sine qua non for businesses to operate.
Thank you very much for keeping it brief. Ajayi.
Mr. Vice President, ladies and gentlemen, I think with the points that I've made with great erudition, there's very little to add. But in the context of the subject of today, which is the fact that we have many agencies of government and a multi-headed form of regulation, it's clear that the main thing is legislative. We would have to have serious legislative action to get real traction in what we aim for. But before then, because I guess that will take time, I think a number of things can be done. And the first is that we should consider how we've treated federal character, which the Vice President spoke about yesterday, and statism, which has been spoken about today, which is the fact that a lot of people have put these things on their head, and you find that agencies of government and regulations are created as a means of political patronage and a means of people meeting their own ends. So, as Obi mentioned, you had 6 agencies becoming 22, simply because some people think, well, we must have federal character, and therefore we have many more people in government, and there are people who want to create jobs for the boys. So we've got to drive that into our minds and make sure that federal character has real meaning, which is to ensure proper representation of the country in our governance, and that we take away statism in our affairs. The second thing is that we inherited a regime or a system of governance, a constitution handed to us by the military. So what we have is a mindset that of central control, which we need to deal with. And therefore, you find that there are so many things concentrated in the federal government. And until we devolve powers to the states, and we've seen with the example of our governor, who is busy with his iPad, that things can be done actively by state governments, and that bones can be broken, as were broken in Abuja, they can be broken in the states. And there can be effective governance even at that level, because what you hear people say is that, well, the state governments do not have the capacity to do these things. The Vice President spoke yesterday about leadership, and that the solution to our problem is that we see that there's leadership, and our leadership leads by example. And he tied that to transparency and accountability. But I think we need to drill that down, and we need to begin to bring to reality the things we've had this morning. So you find you have civil servants and public servants, as the head of service mentioned, that are trained, but then they are inhibited in doing what they need to do. So for instance, you have a good public servant who doesn't want to act because he thinks there will be a court action against him. The Vice President spoke about working with the judiciary to make sure that our judicial system does not stand in the way of good public service. Principles of law are there to ensure that public servants have the freedom to act and freedom to take decisions. You have a lot of public servants that don't want to act because they don't want a court to sanction them. Public servants don't want to act because EFCC would abuse power and arrest a public servant for taking the right decision. So again, we need to look at these things. And the last one is within the public service itself. The head of service has talked of human service being better. He needs to ensure that his civil service operates like a flat organization. Not that there won't be PAMSECs and directors, there would be. But people need to have the freedom in order to be able to stand their ground and say, PAMSEC, this is the research, this is the way it should go. And he should have a system where if I have given the right advice and the PAMSEC or the minister is going in another direction, he must have a system where I'm able to report that and he's able to sanction the person that is taking a wrong decision, which will not be in the interest of the public. The other point I'd like to mention is reality of our lives. A lot of people make rules without any semblance for realization of what really happens in public. So I think we need to help the civil service an exchange program where he sends his civil servants to work in Stanbic or to work in Phillips Consulting and go there on an exchange program to work there for 6 months or 1 year and see how things are drawn in a different place. Because you find that people that make rules, we find people make rules that has no semblance with reality. No semblance with reality whatsoever. So, for instance, a man in the factories directorate says he wants to regulate the production of crude oil. And you ask yourself, what capabilities does he have when he's been trained to inspect factories? But the man says, I'm going to an oil field because we see these things, and I want to see what you're doing, I want to regulate what you're doing. So some of the things we need to begin to do, which we don't need to change law, is the civil, head of service needs to speak to his people and say, listen, if the oil industry is being regulated for hazardous health by DPR, then Factories Act or Factory Heritage people, please stay away. So we need to begin to look at ways in which we can rationalize things before we begin to change the law, the way Obi said she did in the Ministry of Education. The last point I'd like to make is this. We've got NPA, an operator and a regulator. NNPC, operator and a regulator. NIPOST, operator and a regulator. NLC operator and a regulator. And you have a few other agents of government like that. And it cannot be. You cannot be playing in the field and be regulating the field. And I think we need to begin to look at a system. We need to begin to look at a system where if NPA is a port operator, then it cannot be the regulator. If NIPOS is regulating postal services, then it should not be delivering service. And these are some of the problems that I think we have, some of the problems I think we need to look at. And the last point I'll make is on things that are disruptive in our world today. And what are the things that are disruptive? Technology is disruptive and will make a rich man a poor man tomorrow. Our demographics are disruptive. And the question is the head of service and the vice president cognizant of the nature of our youth? Are they preparing a public service in order to be able to take on our youth to come to work with them? Thank you.
Thank you very much.